we are going to start the second session on the Ombudsman's laws to eradicate social injustice. This session will last until 2:30. We have invited Professor Jinuk Choi to chair this session. Since 2005, Mr. Choi has been a professor at the Department of Public Administration at Korea University. He is also Associate Dean of the Graduate School of Policy Studies and Director of the Institute of Governmental Studies at Korea University. Previously, he was a professor of the University of Hong Kong and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is the author of a number of papers and publications in the area of corruption, government reform, and regulations. Now, let me invite Professor Choi to chair this session. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Choi.
Okay, it works now. Good afternoon, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to session 5-2 of the 2014 Ombudsman Global Conference. My name is Jinuk Choi. I'm the professor of public administration at Korea University, and I'm very pleased to be moderator for this session. The theme of this session is the Ombudsman's roles to eradicate social justice. So please, before we start, let me briefly tell my understanding what this theme is trying to deliver. One of the ultimate goals of the state and government, no matter where and no matter when, is to realize social justice. Unfortunately, this is the case in all places and at all times. So citizens in many countries feel that social justice has been breached. There are many factors of social injustice, ranging from individual greed, systemic failure in organizations, and also increasing income inequality of the society. And these some points are well articulated by Mr. Tyndall's presentation a little later. However, we know that the state and government, with a huge amount of powers and authorities, has been one of the factors of the social injustice. In this regard, the role of the ombudsman is so critical on the ground that this institution plays as a countervailing forces when citizens and society suffer from abuse and misuse of government powers and authorities. Therefore, I believe that the theme of this session is really timely and relevant to increase our awareness of what and how ombudsman should do. And our two distinguished speakers from Ireland and China will touch upon this issue in their presentations. This session will be held in 1 hour with two presentations. So I think each presenter will have approximately 20 minutes for their talk. And after two papers are delivered, I'll try to give a brief summary of these two presentations. And then I'll open the floor to receive some comments and questions about 10 or 15 minutes. Right? Keeping track of time is my responsibility, so I'll try my best to manage in this session in a timely manner. Now I think it's time to introduce our distinguished speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Commissioner Fukui. Commissioner Fukui was born in September 1962 in China. He received his bachelor's degree from Beijing Normal University in 1983, majoring in philosophy. After graduation, Commissioner Fukui stayed at the university as a teacher. His civil service career started in 1986 when he entered the Central Commission for Discipline Inspector of CPC, which is called CCDI, and the Minister of Supervision. Since then, Commissioner Fukui worked in the Fifth Case Investigation Department, Research Institute, Law Enforcement Supervision Department, and General Office successively. In 2010, Commissioner Fukui was appointed as a Vice Secretary General of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection of CPC and the Director General of the General Office of the Ministry of Supervision. In 2014, Commissioner Fukui was appointed as Deputy Director General, which is a vice ministerial level of the National Corruption Prevention Bureau and the Director General of the International Cooperation Department of Ministry of Supervision. Mr. Fukui's presentation title is Resolutely Combating Corruption and Safeguarding People's Interests, which for me is very intriguing and very interesting. Would you please extend a warm welcome to Mr. Fukui for his wonderful presentation?
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to attend the AOA Board of Directors building meeting and the 옴부즈만 Global Conference in Seoul. On behalf of the Ministry of Supervision of the People's Republic of China, I would like to express congratulations on the success of the conference. I will first give you a brief introduction to the recent anti-corruption campaign in China, and then to how we safeguard people's interests in the fight against corruption. The Chinese government has attached great importance to anti-corruption ever since the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China in 2012. The anti-corruption campaign has been launched with strong resolution and firm leadership. We focus our work on three aspects. First, improving work styles. The central government issued 8-point call to improve work styles and maintain close ties with the people. The call sets strict regulations about improving research work, reducing meetings and paper documents, regulating business traveling, as well as practicing economy. The high-ranking officials are required to lead by examples in implementing the code. The purpose of the movement is to build a serving, practical, and clean government. Since its establishment in 2013, the new administration has made a promise with the people. During this administration, no new government buildings should be constructed. The number of employees at public expenses should not be increased, and the public funds used for public reception, business traveling abroad, and purchasing public cars should not be increased. The supervisory organs seriously perform their duty to check whether public servants comply with the regulations, handle and expose cases of violation. We need great support from the people. Second, resolutely punish corruption. We adhere to the principle that we must fight every corrupt phenomenon and punish every corrupt official. Supervisory organs investigate and punish corruption cases with special attention to the crime of bribery, dereliction of duty, and binding law for private gains. In 2013, all supervisory organs in the country received a total number of 1.19 million complaints. About 118,000 officials were given disciplinary sanctions. The Ministry of Supervision has punished more than 30 officials at provincial levels. It is the strong resolution of the government to show to the society that no one enjoys absolute power outside the law. Third, enhancing restriction and supervision on power. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has the sign that power should be exercised within the cage of the regulations. We dispatch inspection groups to tour around the country to find out typical problems and urging leading officials to perform their duty with integrity. Last year, inspection groups have toured 34 local places and departments, came back with many clues of corruption cases. These clues are further classified and dealt with. In order to reduce power resisting, we continue the reform of administrative approval system. So far, about 400 items of administrative approval procedures have been cleared or devolved to local governments. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to brief you on how supervisory organs safeguard people's interests by fighting against corruption. Corruption might compromise social justice and do harm to public interests. Supervisory organs set it as a goal to protect the rights of the people. A. Serious handling public complaints. The Constitution endows the citizen with the right to criticize, suggest, appeal, complain, or accuse state organs and functionaries. Special departments for handling letters and calls of complaints have been set up in supervisory organs at all levels. Citizens could write letters, pay visits, make calls, or report online. The Ministry has started the reporting hotlines and website. The average number of complaints received online is 700 every day. Complaints received will be classified and transferred to the relevant authorities to be dealt with. A feedback will be delivered to the whistleblowers when the case is closed in a timely manner. B. Investigating cases that harm interests of the people. We stick to the principle that we should crack down on the flies and tigers higher up. In other words, we will handle major corruption cases of leading officials and at the same time investigate cases of corruption and malpractice to safeguard interests of the people. Officials are held accountable for law efficiency and rude manner to the public. In 2013, 20 sworn officials were held accountable for misconduct. The Ministry of Supervision participated in investigation of 4 serious accidents, giving administrative sanction to 6 provincial-level officials. C. Protecting rights of whistleblowers. In order to protect the rights of whistleblowers and promote social justice, the Chinese government issued a lot of law and regulations. In 2005, the State Council published the state regulations on petition of letters and visits, stating that public servants who disclose reported information to persons being complained of will be given administrative sanctions. Sanctions will also be given to those who retaliate against whistleblowers, and if there is a crime, the person concerned will be persecuted. According to the state administrative supervision law, supervisory organs should keep secret the reported matter, handling stages, and information of the whistleblowers. Supervisory organs nationwide establish special offices to receive visits of the public for the purpose of regulating behavior of staff in reporting centers. The Ministry further formulates the regulations of whistleblowers protection and sanction for violation of work discipline for supervisors. It is the mutual aspiration of all people and common task faced by all government to combat corruption and uphold integrity. The AOA plays an important role in promoting international exchanges and cooperation of administrative supervision and anti-corruption. The Ministry of Supervision of China is willing to deepen exchange and cooperation with our Asian counterparts and to promote our work respectively. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Fukui, for excellent presentation. And this presentation provides us very important background and information what the Ministry of Supervision works for what. Let me introduce our second presenter, Mr. Peter Tyndall. Peter Tyndall was appointed as Ombudsman for Ireland on December 2nd, 2013. He's responsible for providing redress in respect of almost all public services provided by or on behalf of the state and local government. Mr. Tyndall previously served as a Public Services Ombudsman for Wales. He has spoken and written extensively on Ombudsman's matter, covering areas such as the impact of privatization and independence. He has developed his offices in an innovative way, focusing on improving access, customer care, efficiency, and effectiveness. He is a former chair of the Ombudsman Association and president of the European region of the International Ombudsman Institute. His presentation topic is measures to ensure the Ombudsman's impartiality. Would you please welcome Mr. Tyndall for his presentation?
Thank you very much, Chair. It's been an absolute privilege to be here. It's great to be able to participate in such a well-run conference and with such a diverse range of speakers and topics. And I suppose in addressing my topic, one of the things that I've been pondering the last few days is when you see the diversity of ombudsman institutions that are present here, the different powers they have, the different ways they go about doing their jobs, one of the questions that inevitably arises is, what is an ombudsman? Clearly, we've come a long way since Sweden 200 years ago, and many of the services we're hearing about are very different to those that the Swedish model would have represented. And so it does beg the question, what sets us apart? What makes us different to other institutions designed to provide citizens with guarantees about the qualities of services they receive and the ethical standards of the public bodies which are providing them? I've been trying to work out or think about what are the irreducible core values that make an ombudsman different to any other kind of institution. And you think about it, the circumstances in which we deliver our services have changed profoundly over the last 200 years. And in fact, when you're here in Korea, you can say the circumstances have changed profoundly in the last 20 years. Things continue to change. We have to adapt to very different public services. We've heard talk of the impact of privatization. We've heard talk of the development of multiple ombudsman organizations within individual states. And also the institution has to adapt to the very different cultures of societies in which the Ombudsman institution has been established, very different legal systems, and very different technologies with which public services are now being delivered and which we're trying to create access to our own services. Now, I've always seen the Ombudsman as very much part of the justice system, the administrative justice system, and drawing some of its key characteristics from that. So the important thing is the Ombudsman isn't an advocate for the citizen, which when you think about what the name means, we've heard one or two people attempt to translate the Swedish, and I think it translates quite with difficulty. But as close as anything else, the word means representative. And yet, for all of us, that's precisely what we're not to some extent, because what we try to be is independent arbiters. We're not advocates for citizens. Neither are we organs of the state. Our job is to come between the citizen and the state and to provide judgment, a neutral judgment, based on the facts. So clearly objectivity is very important to us. But a lot of the time when people talk about independence of ombudsmen, I don't think they make that parallel with the judiciary. Most of us would be very familiar with the concept of judicial independence, that judges must be seen to stand apart so that the decisions they reach are entirely on the basis of the evidence in front of them. But as ombudsman, that's precisely what we try to do as well. And in that sense, the independence, the impartiality of the ombudsman is very similar to that which we aspire to achieve for the judiciary. And why would you not simply go to court if you're unhappy with the service you're receiving from a public body? And I think the answers to that are complex. Clearly, for many people and in many societies, cost is a straightforward one. The business of going to court can be expensive. You have to hire lawyers. If you lose, you may have costs awarded against you. So going to court is difficult from that point of view, but it's also difficult for people because they simply don't want to stand up and describe the circumstances of their poor treatment by public services in that kind of very public arena. And in that context, you have two characteristics of the Ombudsman which are of fundamental importance. First of all, we're free. People can come to us without having to pay, unlike the case of going to a court or otherwise. But also, we're confidential. You can bring your case to us, we will examine it, but it doesn't expose you to public scrutiny. For people, some of the people, for instance, who come to my office come in circumstances where they've lost a loved one through mistakes on part of the health service. Those people are already traumatized. They want to find out what happened. They want an explanation. They want to make sure it won't happen to anyone else. And only last week I published a report about poor end-of-life care within the health service. Those people could go to court conceivably, but they're already suffering the trauma of having lost a loved one in very difficult circumstances. They actually want to make sure that when somebody else goes into that hospital, the same thing won't happen to them. And that's what we offer, an opportunity to put things right. And that's one of the things that makes us different. I think one of the other distinguishing features is what happens when something has gone wrong. Yes, we'll act to make sure that the individual gains redress, that where possible they're put back in the circumstances they would have been in if the injustice hadn't occurred. Not always possible to do that, but we will also look to put systems right. And we've heard a lot from many of our speakers today, not least Mr. Fu, about the importance of making systemic corrections to systems which have failed. Now, our work, though, unlike a court's, doesn't stop when the judgment has been made. We make recommendations. In some instances, as we've heard from our colleague this morning from Pakistan, we have great powers of coercion. Some of us might envy the powers of the Pakistan Ombudsman, but most of us make recommendations, and most of the time our recommendations are implemented. But it's not enough to accept an agreement at the end of a case. It's not enough to accept an agreement from a public body that they'll do what you're recommending. You actually have to go back and get evidence that they have done what they said they're going to do. And then you have to get evidence that it's had the desired outcome. So if, for instance, we look at a situation where somebody has received poor treatment and you determine that that was because the staff concerned didn't have the skills they needed, and that as well as putting that individual back in the position they should have been in, the staff need to be retrained, I would habitually look for evidence of what training was provided, which members of staff went on it, and whether it had been effective or not, whether the changes in practice that were required were actually achieved by way, for example, of an audit of the service. So some of those things make us different to the courts, because when you walk through the door of the court, whatever the judgment, that's the end of the court's involvement. Whereas ombudsman organisations continue to have an ongoing involvement with the bodies in their jurisdiction to try to ensure continuous improvement of their services. Now, I also talked about this business of identifying systemic faults. So many individuals want us to actually deal with failings that are endemic to the services we deal with, whether that's because of individual error, problems with training or systems, poor management, or even because the law, as we've heard, has unintended consequences. Sometimes laws are made with the best of intentions, but what happens when they're put into practice means that we see injustice. And as we've heard from several colleagues in the course of the conference, sometimes you can find that there was no maladministration, and yet somebody suffered an injustice. And our colleague Connie from Hong Kong spoke to us today about how she uses mediation to try and tackle that ongoing injustice, even where the maladministration didn't occur. But we also heard from our colleagues from Indonesia and elsewhere about the need to change the law if it is bringing about injustice. And those are important characteristics of the Ombudsman institution, which sets it apart, which gives you an answer to the question, if you didn't have one, would you invent it? And the answer for many countries in recent years has been yes. Now, normally, as I've said, when we make recommendations, they're implemented. And what does that arise from? It arises, as we've also heard, from the moral authority of the Ombudsman. And some of the characteristics that bring that about is the depth of the investigation, the quality of the investigation, the rigour of the investigation, the appropriateness of the findings, and clearly justifying the recommendations that you're making, so that it can be obvious to anyone scrutinising the work of the Ombudsman that in recommending particular changes, that was the appropriate response to the problems that were identified. But for Ombudsmen to do all of this work, they must be seen to be impartial. And to do that, they have to be clearly independent of the bodies in their jurisdiction. I'm going to look at some of the key criteria which are seen as the hallmarks of independence. To do that, I'm going to draw on both the rules of the IOI, the International Ombudsman Institute, and also the British and Irish Ombudsman Association, which has given a lot of thought to these issues, as I'm sure have other ombudsman associations in different parts of the world. We looked at where the term ombudsman came from. It came from Sweden. And we think that the term ombudsman's been around for 200 years, but it's been around for rather longer than that. But the original ombudsman was appointed by the king to act as his go-between with the people. And to an extent, the original ombudsman's role was to make sure that what the king said was actually getting done. And what changed 200 years ago was that we got a parliamentary ombudsman institution, which was clearly appointed by the parliament in Sweden and not by the government. And I think for me that's the first of the key characteristics. Ombudsmen should be, to be independent, they need not to be appointed by the people in their jurisdiction. One of the impacts we've seen of privatisation is that there are now ombudsmen dealing with services that were previously within the public domain. So we've seen energy ombudsmen, for instance, dealing with gas and electricity services, which previously would have been within the remit of the public service ombudsman. Some of those bodies are established by law, by statute. They're clearly independent of the industry that they supervise, and therefore do have many of the characteristics that we would recognise as an ombudsman. But in France, for example, there are organisations called ombudsmen, or médiateurs, who are actually appointed by the energy companies they're said to supervise. Now, I suspect their customers don't have the same faith in those individuals as they would have done in us when we were doing that particular job. So I think that's one of the characteristics. The other one, which it seems to me, is that the appointment process is key to the independence of the Ombudsman. I think it's key in a number of respects. First of all, it should be clearly open and transparent. My successor in Wales was appointed by a process where there was open advert, there was an interview process which involved an independent, another ombudsman from another country, was engaged as an independent assessor to ensure that the process was carried out objectively. There were professionals in HR and making sure that the processes followed were administratively correct, and it was undertaken by the parliamentary body and not by the government. It seems to me that that has the characteristics, that particular example has the characteristics you would look for. Too often, as was the case, for instance, in Ireland in the past, the process by which somebody got to become ombudsman was anything but transparent, and a name would emerge and that person would duly be voted upon by the Parliament without any sense of where that name had come from. And you got the sense that there must have been ministerial telephone calls saying, "Excuse me, are you busy? Would you like to be ombudsman?" So it's very important that the process should be open and transparent. It should be conducted by the parliamentary body if it's a public service ombudsman and not conducted by the government. But it should also be, I think, that people should be appointed for a term of office that gives them sufficient time to do the job properly, time to understand the job, to be effective within it, but a fixed term of office. My own preference is for a single, longer fixed term of office. You see people being elected for 7, 8, or 10 years. It seems to me that's a good way of doing things. When you have renewable terms of office and shorter terms of office, then you get certain things become possible, which I don't think are good for the independence of the institution. Certainly where government appointments are made, it's not unknown for ombudsmen to be very quiet in the run-up to the re-election in the hope that they won't upset the people who have to reappoint them. One person who clearly didn't follow such a route was André Morin, our colleague from Ontario. He describes the process as being unfired, which I thought was very good. But it is this sense in which, my view is that if there is to be a second term of office, then there should be clear criteria by which the person will be retained or not retained. It should not go to another open appointment process at that point. And that's one of the other things that can fundamentally undermine the individuals. We've heard talk on occasions here of voluntary ombudsmen, of part-time ombudsmen, and of unpaid ombudsmen. One of the things I would say is that by and large, one of the critical things is that ombudsmen need to be sufficiently well remunerated, paid, so as to be clearly beyond influence, beyond corruption. But certainly the ability to set their salary, again, should not fall within the remit of the bodies in their jurisdiction, because that's a very easy way to undermine their autonomy. Cutting the budget of the ombudsman is a much more subtle way of undermining them than most others. In the distant past in Ireland, my office is 30 years old, the first ombudsman worked with a government which historically has come to be seen as quite corrupt. when he started to be very effective in highlighting that corruption, his budget was reduced. His budget was reduced quite sharply, making it very difficult for him to do his job. Now, he did go to the Parliament, and he succeeded in having his budget restored. But it does point to the thing that to be independent, you have to have the necessary resources to enable you to do your job. And whereas people think about independence as being about appointment or as being about not being subject to the bodies in jurisdiction, in fact, financial independence is one of the vital characteristics that every ombudsman needs to look to. So, being visibly and demonstrably independent from those who the Ombudsman has the power to investigate, the people who appoint being independent also, the term of office being of sufficient duration and remuneration, all of those are important things, and also the ability to ensure that the appointment won't be subject to premature termination. In other words, if you don't like this ombudsman, we'll get rid of them and we'll get another one who might give us better decisions. There actually needs to be that guarantee of tenure. Now, the body to whom the ombudsman is accountable is another key feature of independence. We know that our Korean colleagues spent a long time yesterday being accountable to their parliament, and I think that's a challenging task that we all face. But it is important to have access, if you're a public services ombudsman, to the body, the parliamentary body, or the municipality in which you work. So you shouldn't be working to the government, you should be working to that parliamentary body. Preferably, you should have a committee, a standing committee, which receives the annual report of the Ombudsman, and such other special reports are required, because quite often, if people are reluctant to implement recommendations, being able to go to a committee of the Parliament or the Parliament itself and holding that body to account by way of a special report is a fundamental way of ensuring that recommendations are implemented. And it is surprising how many bodies withdraw their reluctance to implement recommendations when they realise that they're about to be the subject of a report to Parliament, which would clearly reflect very poorly on them. So, just to summarise it again, public service ombudsman should preferably be established as an officer of the Constitution. When you look at many of the newer ombudsman institutions in Central and Eastern Europe and in Africa, the ombudsman institution is being established as the Constitution is being written. And so the ombudsman is written into the Constitution. That means the government of the day cannot remove the institution of the ombudsman without a vote of the people. And that, to me, is the best way of securing the independence of the ombudsman, by making it a constitutional position, in the same way as the independence of the judiciary is often secured within the Constitution. So, having looked at all of those criteria, the next question is it simply a matter of having all of these structural factors in place? Is that enough to make sure that the office is seen to be independent? Or are there issues about perception? Do you need both to be independent and to be seen to be independent? One of the things that often undermines the independence of the Ombudsman in the eyes of the public is the fact that sometimes, quite often, we are not upholding their complaints. We're not upholding their complaints because when we look at them, we see that although they're unhappy and although they feel they've been subject to an injustice, as Connie Lau again described in her presentation this morning, for all that they're unhappy, we can't find that the administration has actually done anything wrong. Now, under those circumstances, staff too have a critical job to play. The staff of the office have a critical job to play in managing the expectations of complainants from the point at which they first contact you. Many of us are familiar with the idea that staff become hardened to complainants. They start sometimes to see complainants as not having a legitimate case. And too often you see staff saying, you complained to me about this, I asked the body for their opinion, this is what they said, so you're wrong. They're not saying, we have looked at both sides and reached an opinion. They're actually repeating what's being said to them by the body in jurisdiction. Fundamental to that, or to correcting that or making sure it doesn't happen, are two things. One of them is the way that staff are trained and the ongoing training provided to staff, because this is something that needs to be continuously reinforced with staff. And the other one, as many of us are dealing with caseloads, and some of the caseloads, of course, are vast, it becomes impossible for an ombudsman to have personal sight of every decision. But you have to have really good quality control measures in place to make sure that your staff are being objective and impartial when they're operating under delegated powers from you. Many complaints, as we've also heard, are resolved without a formal decision being made, whether it's by mediation, whether by a quick fix. Somebody rings up, they have a problem with the municipal housing. Much easier to ring the housing organisation and ask them to fix it than it is to write a report, and usually that's what the person wants anyway. But that does mean the visibility of lots of our work just isn't there. Bodies in jurisdiction don't see it, complainants don't see it. We're doing a lot of work, nobody knows what's going on. So, under those circumstances, where there is a complaint, it's important for the purposes of where people are unhappy about a decision, it's really important that where we have appeals, that a different member of staff looks at it. Because otherwise people presume that we're simply saying again what we've said in the first place, simply repeating it. Now, one of the fundamental things about persuading people about how impartial we are is just this whole thing about public visibility. Not many of us will enjoy the public profile that's enjoyed, for instance, by Günther Kreiter as Austrian Ombudsman, where he has a prime-time television show every week on his work. And unless he's up against the World Cup, he has very good viewing figures. And similarly, we know our colleague Diane Wellborn has good access to the media. Andre Moran has talked also. I think fundamentally you have to be able to let the people within the territorial limits of your jurisdiction know that the work you're doing is independent and impartial. And if they don't hear about it, they simply won't believe you. So actually getting yourself out there, being seen by the public and having a high public profile works in two ways. First of all, it shows people that you're effective. It shows people that you're impartial. The other thing it does is anyone who's ever bothered to check their website hits after a significant report has been aired on TV or in the local media, it also makes sure that people come to you, continue to come to you with your complaints, which is the surest measure of trust of an ombudsman that you have. The fact that people continue to come to us with their difficulties and ask us to resolve them demonstrates that they think that we can offer them redress in a world where they often feel that the balance of power strongly favours the public service providers rather than the citizens. And I think in the end, it's the biggest guarantee of impartiality is that sense that people are coming to the door or emailing or phoning to say, please sort this out. And that's what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tyndall, for insightful presentation and suggestions. Okay, before receiving some comments and questions from the floor, let me briefly retouch what these presentations try to deliver to us. For me, every people sitting in this hall like to praise the Ombudsman, and they want the Ombudsman office even stronger, more powerful. But it seems that the people outside of this building, because this area is famous for government complex in Korea, now the majority of the government buildings and offices are reallocated to Sejong City, but still we have the very big building in front of this the building. So the people who are working there right now don't welcome Ombudsman, because probably Ombudsman is a kind of entity which bother them, even though they believe that they are doing their best not to breach the rights of the people. But anyway, this is a misperception. We know that the power to the good is the power to the harm. So there is always danger and possibility that government will, violate the human rights. So the way how Ombudsman is functioning and working in a very efficient, effective manner is very important to protection for people's rights and individual rights. I think that two presentations by Mr. Fukui and Mr. Tyndall is a little bit different. They actually talk about a different aspect of the Ombudsman. First of all, Mr. Tyndall actually gives a lot of some fundamental principles and sort of checklists that every Ombudsman office has to probably remember and follow. He talked about the basic functions of Ombudsman, and he delivered some key values. It's more than the attitude of the office. I think this is the kind of key values of the Ombudsman office have to keep and maintain. They are sort of, the autonomy, independence, and fairness, and also impartiality, and fairness, and also effectiveness, openness, transparency. All these are very important. And if Ombudsman office fail to build their function on this basis, then they lose their legitimacy and they lose trust. So how the Ombudsman office is able to maintain these wonderful, very important values is very critical for the effectiveness of the Ombudsman's office. At the same time, he also point out some key structural features to garner and guarantee those independence and impartiality of the Ombudsman's office, how the Ombudsman's office has to be structured and has to be managed is also very critical. So every country has a different institutional basis and also legal basis. They have different powers, authorities, but these are key principles that every Ombudsman to follow in order to carry out their the mandated functions. This is very interesting. And second, Mr. Fukui's presentation tells about what is happening, what is doing in China. And in fact, China is so huge country. And during the lunchtime, I sat together with Mr. Fukui and asked some few questions about the organization. And how many people are working in the midst of supervision? Well, in the headquarters in Beijing, he told me that there is approximately 1,000 staff in the ministry. You may say this is not big, but this is a fact, because this is only the number of person who's stationed in headquarters of Beijing. So taking all numbers together who are working in the midst of supervision, there are more than 470,000 people. So huge, right? And like so much as the huge size of the organization, the ministry has also a huge amount of powers from receiving complaints from the people and start investigation and give some recommendations, sort of things. So these powers with a huge amount of personnel should be well functioned, well exercised. So one of the key message that what Mr. Tyndall tried to say is that I was very impressed about this message. The Ombudsman's office must be based on moral authority. So that means, I guess Ombudsman and some law enforcement agencies are thought to be the land of last resort. If the people don't trust those organizations. They don't no place to go. So Ombudsman office may be the fundamental, the place to give the confidence to the people. There is at least one organization which is very neutral, independent in order to keep our rights. Right? So these are very wonderful presentations, and when you combine these presentations together, we can see the whole picture, how Ombudsman and what Ombudsman should do. Okay, now we have approximately 7 minutes to finish, so let me invite some questions, comments. Before asking questions or giving some comments, please tell us who you are, and please explain to whom your question, comments goes. Questions, comments? Yes.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 권익위원회 정은수라고 합니다. 일단 두 분 발표 잘 들었고요. 저는 커미셔너 후쿠이님께 질문 드리고 있습니다. 작년부터 중국이 UN 반부패 협약, UN Convention Against Corruption 이행 점검을 받고 있고, 지금 이에 대응해서 중국 본토하고 홍콩, 마카오가 각각의 보고서를 이렇게 준비하고 있는 걸로 알고 있는데요. 이거는 그러니까 중국 본토하고 특별행정구 간에 상이한 반부패 정책 체계를 갖고 있다는 쪽으로 해석이 되는데, 중앙 반부패 기구로서 그 Ministry of Supervision이 특별행정구, 그러니까 뭐 홍콩의 ICAC 같은 기구, 그런 기구하고 어떤 관계인지, 그리고 하나의 중국으로서 정책적인 통일성이나 일관성을 어떻게 확보하고 있는지에 대해서 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
OK。按照今年，从去年7月1日开始，中国接受联合国反腐败公约履约审议，我们按照联合国履约审议秘书处的有关规定，我们和香港、澳门3地共同形成一个报告，香港和澳门的，是独立做的，和中国内地一起合在一起。香港和澳门的是他们自己独立做的，按照香港的法律和制度。
From July the 1st last year, as you have mentioned, that we have started our UN Convention Against Corruption review mechanism in China. According to the requirement by the Secretariat, we accomplished or we completed a whole report, including 3 parts. One is the mainland, and the other 2 are from Hong Kong and Macau. But we draft our own reports independently.
这3部分报告作为报到国务院之后，就是中央政府。中央政府重点要看港澳这部分报告的，主要是中央和港澳地区的关系。
When this report is completed, it is sent to the central government for approval, and the central government focused mainly on the conformality of the 3 reports, with emphasis on the reports from Macau and from Hong Kong.
谢谢。
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
네, 두 분 그 발표 잘 들었습니다. 국민권익위원회 김성훈입니다. 아일랜드 옴부즈만 님께 제가 2가지 질문을 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째는 옴부즈만이 독립성과 중립성이 중요하다 이렇게 말씀하셨는데 이론적으로는 저도 거의 공감합니다. 그리고 무엇보다 독립성을 갖춘다는 것은 굉장히 중요하겠죠. 그런데 국민의 권익의 대변자가 아니라 행정기관과 국민과 관계에서 엄정한 중립성을 유지한다는 것이 현실적으로 가능한지, 국민들이 행정기관으로부터 피해를 받은 상황에서 민원을 내는데 행정기관과 관계에서 중립성을 유지하는 것이 옴부즈만의 신뢰를 확보하는 데 도움이 되는지, 구체적인 방법이 있다면 어떤 것이 있는지 말씀해 주시고요. 두 번째 질문은 옴부즈만의 권고는 강제력이 없기 때문에 권고 후에 수용이라든가 이행을 제고하기 위한 노력이 더 중요하다고 말씀하셨습니다. 저희도 거기에 대해서 공감합니다. 그러면 결국은 행정기관의 수용성과 이행력을 제고하기 위해서는 옴부즈만에게 또 다른 강제적은 아니지만 여러 가지 보완적인 권한이라든가 수단들이 있어야 될 것이라고 생각되는데 아일랜드 같은 경우는 법적으로 어떤 그런 권한들을 갖고 있는지, 그리고 실질적으로 그런 권한 외에 이행이나 수용성을 제고하기 위해서 옴부즈만이 어떤 행정적인 노력들을 하고 있는지 이런 것을 소개해 주셨으면 고맙겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you. I'm glad you agree independence is important. But I think the point about not representing citizens is a really interesting one, because I think it links to the second point, which is that because we only make recommendations, if the bodies in jurisdiction think we're acting as an advocacy body rather than an independent arbiter, it's very difficult to persuade them then to implement recommendations. On the other hand, I agree with you. When it's obvious, when you find that a public body has caused an injustice to a citizen through unfairness or not complying with the law, then at that point it becomes the Ombudsman's job to put things right. And I think that's probably the fundamental difference. So you first of all have to objectively determine the facts. What happened? Did something go wrong? But if something did go wrong, then you do become an advocate on behalf of citizens, because it's your job to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think you're absolutely right. You would have to be very hard-hearted indeed to deal with the cases we see and not to be touched by the difficulties people experience because of the injustices they suffer. So I think it's true that there comes a point when you're an advocate, but you're an advocate after you decide that the public body has done something wrong. Now, the other point, as Ombudsman in Ireland, I can make recommendations. My recommendations are not legally binding. If a body in jurisdiction chooses not to implement those recommendations, then I have access to the Parliament via parliamentary committee, where I can report about that refusal to implement recommendations. Now, in my previous job as Ombudsman in Wales, I also only made recommendations. In all of my time there, none of my recommendations weren't implemented. Now, I think that speaks to the fact that people respect the quality of the decision-making, and B, that they don't want to be seen in front of the Parliament to be refusing the reasonable request of the Ombudsman. Now, my predecessor in Ireland, Emily O'Reilly, did have one very high-profile case which wasn't up, where the Parliament, the government of the day, refused to implement her recommendations. And we continue to have discussions, I continue to have discussions with the government about that. But the reality is the vast majority of the recommendations are implemented without question. However, as more and more services are privatised, I think we need to take a different approach. I think public bodies are subject to political oversight, and by and large, the political oversight is sufficient to ensure that recommendations are implemented. Private bodies are not subject to political oversight. Private sector ombudsmen, by and large, where they exist, have binding powers. So if a body wants not to implement their recommendations, they must appeal the decision to the courts. And for my mind, where more and more private bodies are coming into the jurisdiction of ombudsman, then we need to have binding powers, because those bodies will be more likely to ignore the recommendations because they don't fear the scrutiny of Parliament.
Okay, thank you for your point of reply. Time is almost up, so probably you have more questions and comments, but I want to ask you to use break time after this session. As a conclusion, I'd like to say the Ombudsman is not only the watchdog against the malpractice of government, but I think Ombudsman must also play as a problem solver of maladministration in the government. I hope that every participant in this room will gain a very useful and informative information from these two wonderful presentations. And I also want you to work together to build a very concrete stepping stone to make our government more accountable by making our ombudsman function more effectively. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.